Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that like button and subscribe for more chill history vibes that'll help you drift off. Tonight we're diving into something that's perfect for winding down, why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. Yeah, that era we all romanticize with knights and castles, forget it. It's a slow burn of misery, and we're gonna unpack it nice and easy. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, settle in, and let your mind wander back a few centuries. No rush, just a gentle float through the past. We'll talk about the everyday grind, the royal messes, and all the little things that'd have you begging for a time machine home. All right, let's ease into this. Imagine waking up in medieval Europe, say around the 1300s. Not in some fancy palace, but where most folks were, stuck in a peasant hut. Your bed? A pile of straw on the dirt floor, shared with your whole family and maybe a few farm animals for that extra warmth. Because why not double down on the coziness with some goats snoring next to you? The roof's thatched, leaking when it rains and infested with bugs that think your scalp is prime real estate. You roll over, scratch at the fleas biting your legs, and realize hygiene isn't exactly a priority here. Bathing? That's a once-a-year luxury if you're lucky. And soap? More like a distant dream. Most people just rubbed themselves down with a cloth or jumped in a river during summer. But come winter, forget it. You'd stink like everyone else, a mix of sweat, smoke, and whatever mud you tracked in yesterday. Now it's dawn, and you're up because the sun dictates your schedule. No alarm clocks, just roosters crowing like they've got a personal grudge. Breakfast isn't some avocado toast situation. If you're a peasant, which is about 90% of the population, you're looking at a hunk of coarse bread made from rye or barley, maybe watered down with ale because water is often contaminated and could kill you faster than starvation. Ale's safer, they say, but it's weak stuff, not the craft beer you're used to. And speaking of food, it's monotonous. Porridge, peas, beans, maybe some cheese if the cows cooperated. Meat? That's for feast days, or if you poach something from the Lord's forest and don't get caught. Poaching could cost you a hand, or worse. Of course, the nobles are eating venison and spiced pies up in their castles, but down here, you're grinding your teeth on gritty bread that wears them down by age 30. Let's talk about work, because that's your whole day. As a peasant, you're tied to the land, working for the local lord in a system called feudalism. You plow his fields 3 days a week, then squeeze in time for your own tiny plot, plowing with oxen if you're fortunate, or by hand if not. The soil's poor, tools are basic, wooden plows that barely scratch the surface. Crops fail often due to bad weather, pests, or just plain exhausted earth. Remember the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317? Yeah, endless rain rotted the harvests, and people starved by the millions. You'd be eating bark, roots, or worse. Rumors of folks turning to cannibalism in the desperation. But hey, at least it's equal opportunity misery. Even kings felt the pinch when taxes dried up. And if famine doesn't get you, there's always the Black Death lurking around the corner. That plague hit in 1347, wiping out a third of Europe. Fleas from rats jump on you, you swell up with buboes, fever hits, and poof, gone in days. No antibiotics, no hospitals, just prayers and maybe a barber surgeon bleeding you out, which, surprise, makes it worse. Shifting gears a bit, let's float over to the towns, because maybe you think urban life was better. Nope. Cities like London or Paris were crammed with people, narrow streets overflowing with garbage and sewage tossed from windows. Gardez-l'eau, they'd yell before dumping a chamber pot, but good luck dodging it. Rivers doubled as toilets and drinking sources, so dysentery was your constant companion. Folks called it the flux, and it dehydrated you into oblivion. Houses were timber-framed, packed tight, and fires spread like gossip. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was post-medieval, but similar blazes happened all the time earlier. You'd lose everything in a blink. No insurance, just rebuild and hope for the best. And crime? Thieves everywhere, pickpockets in markets, bandits on roads. Justice was swift and brutal. Hangings for stealing bread if you were poor, while nobles got slaps on the wrist. But okay, maybe you're fantasizing about being nobility to escape the peasant grind. Think again. Even up there, life was a parade of dysfunction. Take the royals. They kept it all in the family, literally. Inbreeding was the name of the game to keep power consolidated. The Habsburgs were pros at it later on, but medieval kings weren't slouches. Charles II of Spain was a poster child for it centuries later, but roots go back. Marriages between cousins or uncles and nieces? Standard procedure. Philip II of France married his niece Ingeborg, but that was more political mess than genetic. Still, it led to deformities and health issues down the line. Kings like Edward III of England had huge families, but half the kids died young from diseases or accidents. And the personal lives? Tragic soap operas. Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, power couple on paper, but their sons rebelled constantly. Family feuds that tore the kingdom apart. Henry locked Eleanor up for 16 years because she sided with the kids. Romantic, right? Let's linger on some quirky royal habits because even the elite had their weird sides. King John of England, yeah, the Magna Carta guy, he was paranoid, hoarding money like a dragon, and had a habit of losing wars and alienating everyone. They say he chewed his gloves in rage fits, but mostly he just moped around, taxing people into poverty. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, brave warrior, but spent more time crusading than ruling, and died from a gangrenous arrow wound because he wouldn't wear armor while mocking a castle defender. Ironic, huh? He was called lion-hearted, but ended up forgiving the kid who shot him right before kicking the bucket. Queens weren't spared either. Isabella of France, married to Edward II, she put up with his favorites like Piers Gaveston, who got way too cozy with the king. Rumors of affairs aside, Edward's quirky habit was ditching ditches and thatching roofs for fun, which the nobles found unbecoming. Of course, Isabella eventually rebelled, deposed him, and he met a grisly end, supposedly with a hot poker, but that's probably myth. Still, her life turned from fairy tale to family betrayal. Floating back to everyday folks, health was a joke. No vaccines, no painkillers beyond willow bark or opium if you could afford it. Toothache? Pull it with pliers, no anesthesia. Broken bone? Set it with splints and pray it heals straight. Women in childbirth? High risk. About 1 in 3 didn't make it, and infants even less. Midwives did their best with herbs, but infections were rampant. And nutrition? Scurvy from lack of veggies in winter, rickets from no vitamin D in those dark huts. Kids worked from age 7, herding sheep or gleaning fields, no school unless you were noble born. Education was church stuff from monks, Latin prayers, and copying manuscripts by candlelight, which wrecked your eyes early. Social life wasn't much brighter. The church ran everything. Tithes took 10% of your income, and Sundays were for mass, no work allowed. But that meant boredom unless there was a fair. Festivals happened, sure, with ale and games, but they were rare breaks in the grind. Marriages were arranged for land or alliances, love optional. Divorce? Forget it. Unless you were royal and could annul for consanguinity, aka too related, which was hypocritical given the inbreeding. Widows had it rough, remarried quick or faced poverty. And warfare? Constant. Lords feuded, kings invaded, and peasants got drafted as foot soldiers, cannon fodder with pitchforks against armored knights. The 100 Years' War dragged on, bankrupting everyone and spreading more disease. Let's not skip the weird beliefs that made life harder. Superstitions everywhere. Black cats, bad luck, witches causing crop failures, trials by ordeal, hot iron in hand. If it healed, innocent. Of course, it rarely did. Medicine mixed with magic, leeches for balancing humors, which just weakened you more. Astrology guided decisions. Even kings consulted stars before battles. Edward I of England, the hammer of the Scots, had his quirks too. He expelled Jews in 1290 for money grabs, but personally was tall and temperamental, once throwing a fit and breaking a crown. His son Edward II inherited the mess, and we know how that went. As we ease deeper, consider the food again, because it's a daily torture. No potatoes or tomatoes yet,
Those are New World. So bland stews, salted fish that gave you thirst, and bread that could break teeth if baked wrong. Nobles had spices from trade, but peasants, salt if lucky. And storage, no fridges, so meat rotted quick, leading to botulism. Winters meant slaughtering animals and salting everything, hoping it lasted. Famine years, you'd boil leather shoes for soup. Yeah, that desperate. Hygiene ties in back. No toilets, just pits or chambers. Castles had garderobes, holes over moats, but wind blew back the smell. Peasants used fields or buckets, flies everywhere, spreading typhoid. Bathhouses existed in towns, but the church frowned on them later, calling them sinful. So people itched and scratched, lice in hair, ringworm on skin. Beauty standards? Pale skin for nobles, meaning no sun. Peasants were tanned from fields. Royals powdered faces with lead, which poisoned them slowly. Mary Queen of Scots bathed in wine for skin. Quirky, but ineffective. Let's touch on childhood, because kids had it rough. High mortality, half died before 5 from measles, whooping cough, or diarrhea. Survivors worked young, no playtime. Royal kids? Spoiled but isolated, betrothed at birth, shipped off for alliances. Henry VIII's kids shuffled between courts, emotional wrecks. But medieval earlier, like Louis IX of France, saintly king, but his crusades failed miserably. Captured once, ransomed for a fortune. His mother Blanche ruled as regent, strict and scheming. And the weather? Unpredictable. Little Ice Age starting around 1300 made winters brutal. Rivers froze, crops died, floods ruined fields, droughts cracked earth. No forecasts, just omens. People blamed sins, did penances like flagellation, whipping themselves in processions, worked about as well as you'd expect. So, as we wrap this first stretch, think about sleep. No comfy mattress, just that straw, bugs biting, cold drafts, dreams of better days, but morning brings the same. Of course, there were joys, community, faith, harvest ales, but the hardships stacked high. You'd miss your shower, your fridge, your meds. Medieval times, a slow slog of survival. Let's keep floating on.
All right, we're still drifting through the medieval nightmare, so keep those eyes half closed and that blanket pulled up. Let's slide from the peasant hut straight into the royal bedchamber. Because if you think the castle upstairs was glamorous, oh honey, buckle up for the slowest train wreck in history. First off, the bed itself. It looks huge and fancy in movies, right? 4 posters, velvet curtains, embroidered everything. Cute. In reality, it's a giant wooden box filled with straw or feathers that haven't been changed since the last coronation. Fleas, bed bugs, and moths are having a permanent rave in there. The curtains aren't for romance. They're to keep the drafts and the bugs off your face. And privacy? Zero. Servants sleep on the floor around the bed. Guards stand in the corner, and random nobles wander in at 6 a.m. to watch the king wake up, because that's apparently peak entertainment in 1350. Now the smell. Imagine a room that hasn't had a proper cleaning since the Crusades. Chamber pots under the bed, sometimes emptied, sometimes not. Dogs pee in the rushes on the floor because the rushes are there to soak it up. The king's body odor is layered with rose water and cloves because someone told him it masked the stink. Spoiler, it doesn't. Queen Philippa of England once wrote that her husband Edward III's breath could fell an ox at 20 paces, and that's the polite version. Dental care was a twig and some salt, maybe a silver toothpick if you were extra. By 30, most royals had black stumps or no teeth at all. Sexy times? Hard pass. Speaking of sexy times, let's talk about the wedding night, because that's when the whole court gets involved. The couple is escorted to the bed, blessed by a bishop, and then everyone hangs around until the sheets are inspected the next morning. Bloodstain? Success. No bloodstain? Crisis meeting. Poor Margaret of Anjou had to endure this in 1445 while half the English court stood around drinking and placing bets. She was 15. Harry VI, her husband, was apparently more interested in prayer than performance, so the sheets were a national emergency. They ended up faking it with chicken blood or something. Nobody knows for sure, but the gossip lasted decades. And heirs. Sweet baby Jesus, the obsession with heirs. Queens were basically walking incubators. You pop out a son? Great. You pop out daughters a miscarry, you're on thin ice. Have too many miscarriages, and suddenly everyone whispers that God is punishing you. Take Joan of Navarre, married to Henry IV of England. She had 8 kids with her first husband, then nothing with Henry. Court rumor? Obviously cursed. She spent the rest of her life doing penance just in case. Meanwhile, Henry was busy coughing up blood from whatever mystery disease was eating him alive. Romantic. Let's linger on Henry IV for a second, because the guy was a walking disaster. Seized the throne in 1399, spent the next 14 years putting down rebellions, and his body just gave up. Chronic sores that wouldn't heal, probably syphilis or leprosy, face swollen, hair falling out, and a smell so bad his own doctors gagged. His son, the future Henry V, basically waited in the wings like a vulture. In 1413, Henry IV had a stroke, or seizure, accounts differ, right in Westminster Abbey and collapsed by the fire. They carried him to the Jerusalem chamber, where he woke up enough to ask where he was, got told the name, remembered some prophecy that he'd die in Jerusalem, shrugged, and croaked. The prophecy was about the Holy Land, not a room in London, but sure, close enough.
Meanwhile, over in France, things are somehow worse. Charles VI, the Beloved, who later became the Mad, started having episodes in the 1390s. One minute, he's leading an army. Next minute, he's convinced he's made of glass and will shatter if anyone touches him. He wore iron rods sewn into his clothes for protection. His wife, Isabel of Bavaria, had to deal with this while running the country, because Charles would forget who she was, scream that she was an imposter, and try to attack her with a sword. Court life became a game of hide the king before he hurts himself or someone else. They locked him in a padded apartment with no sharp objects. Imagine being the valet whose job it is to wrestle a screaming monarch into whalebone-reinforced pajamas. And the kids from these marriages? Oh boy. Royal nurseries were basically petri dishes. Edward the Black Prince, hero of Crecy, married his cousin Joan, because of course he did, and their son Richard II came out healthy-ish, but the rest of the brood died young. Richard himself grew up spoiled, vain, and emotionally unstable. Loved fancy clothes, mirrors, and executing his uncles. Real stable guy. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, died of plague at 30, and Richard was so wrecked he had the entire palace where she died demolished brick by brick. Then he married a 7-year-old French princess for peace, because nothing says diplomacy like child brides. Let's float over to Castile for a minute, because Spain was already perfecting the inbreeding arts early. Alfonso XI had 10 kids with his mistress, and only one legit son, Peter the Cruel. Great nickname, by the way. Peter married Blanche of Bourbon, kept her locked up for 2 days, then ditched her for his mistress, and eventually had her murdered. Smooth. His illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, started a civil war, killed Peter personally by stabbing him in the face a bunch of times, and took the throne. Henry II wasn't exactly a health icon either. Chronic asthma, obesity, and died after falling off his horse because he was too fat for the saddle. His descendants kept marrying cousins, setting the stage for the Habsburg jaw centuries early. Back to England, because the Plantagenets never run out of drama. Edward II we mentioned last time, but let's circle back to the bedroom situation. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, made everyone deeply uncomfortable. Parliament kept executing his boyfriends, and Edward kept crying and giving them more land. His wife, Isabella, finally snapped, invaded with her own boyfriend, Roger Mortimer, deposed Edward, and installed their 14-year-old son as Edward III. Edward II's death, officially natural causes, unofficially a red-hot poker, in a very uncomfortable place. Historians argue, but the story stuck because medieval people loved poetic justice. Isabella and Mortimer ruled for a bit, living large, until young Edward III grew a spine, burst in one night in 1330, arrested Mortimer, and had him hanged. Isabella got shipped off to a cushy castle with plenty of wine and zero power. She spent the rest of her life doing embroidery and writing sad letters. Glamorous retirement. We could keep going forever, but let's pause and breathe in the mildew-scented air of a 14th century palace. Silk gowns over unwashed skin, perfume failing to cover the stench of open sores. Kings screaming at hallucinations, while queens fake pregnancies to buy time. Servants stealing scraps and sleeping in hallways. Rats the size of house cats. And everyone pretending this is the height of civilization. Yeah. You still want to time travel? Didn't think so. Let's keep drifting.
Okay, keep that blanket tucked under your chin. We're sliding from the royal bedroom into the royal nursery now. And if you think the grown-ups had it rough, wait till you meet the kids. These poor little heirs and spares spent their entire childhoods being reminded that their only job was to stay alive long enough to breed the next batch of dysfunctional cousins. Spoiler, most of them didn't. First thing you notice in a medieval nursery, it's cold. Stone walls, high ceilings, massive fireplaces that still somehow leave the room freezing. The windows are tiny arrow slits because defense is more important than sunlight. Vitamin D deficiency? Automatic. Rickets? Coming right up. The wet nurse, because queens almost never breastfed, is usually some peasant woman who just lost her own baby. She gets brought in, plopped down on a stool, and told to feed the future king. If her milk dries up or the baby gets sick, she's out on her ear or worse. Margaret Beaufort, the one who eventually birthed Henry VII, was only 13 when she had him in 1457, and the labor nearly killed her. She wrote later that the midwife told her straight up she'd never have another kid. She didn't. One and done, because medieval childbirth was a coin flip every time. Royal babies got swaddled so tight they looked like little burritos, arms pinned to the sides, legs straight, head wrapped. The idea was to make them grow straight and tall. In practice, it just gave them flat heads and hip problems. Then they stuck the kid in a wooden cradle lined with whatever fabric the treasury could spare. Cradle rocked by a servant all night long because stopping meant the baby might cry, and crying wasted calories they couldn't afford to lose. Calories were serious business. Chronic low-grade malnutrition was the norm. Even in palaces, food could be scarce in winter, and the idea of pasteurization hadn't been invented yet. One bad batch of milk, and half the nursery dropped dead from the gripes. Let's talk about Edward of Middleham, only son of Richard III. Cute kid, born around 1473. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief because Richard finally had an heir. Then the boy just wasted away. Pale, weak, probably tuberculosis or some undiagnosed genetic thing from all the cousin marrying in the family tree. Died at age 9, maybe 10. Richard and Anne Neville were reportedly wrecked. Anne herself died a year later, basically of grief and whatever lung thing was going around. Richard lasted 2 more years before Bosworth, but after his son went, he was a ghost walking. The crown was literally all he had left, and we know how that turned out. Over in France, the Valois kids weren't doing any better. Charles VIII was born in 1470, and his mom, Charlotte of Savoy, died when he was 3. Dad, Louis XI, the Spider King, was too busy poisoning people and locking relatives in cages to do much parenting. Charles grew up short, sickly, and weirdly proportioned, 6 toes on 1 foot, supposedly. His favorite hobby was jousting, which, given his balance issues, was a terrible idea. In 1498, at 27, he smacked his head on a low doorway at Amboise, had a stroke, and died 9 hours later in a hallway while servants stepped over him because nobody wanted to move the king to a bed and get blamed. His wife, Anne of Brittany, had already buried 4 babies by that point. She married his cousin next and buried 4 more. That woman had the worst luck in Europe. And the girls? Don't get me started. Royal daughters were bargaining chips with likes. Betrothed before they could walk, shipped off at 12 or 13 to marry some foreign prince they'd never met. Language barrier, culture shock, and oh yeah, the husband is usually 30 years older and smells like a goat. Eleanor of Castile married Edward I of England when she was about 10. Edward was 15 and already taller than most adults. They actually ended up liking each other. Miracle. But she still had 16 pregnancies and only 6 kids made it to adulthood. She died at 39 from what was probably malaria or just sheer exhaustion. Edward was so upset, he built those Eleanor crosses everywhere she stopped on the funeral route. Sweet, but also a reminder that even the good royal marriages were brutal on the body. Let's pause on little Margaret of Norway, the Maid of Norway. Born 1883, only child of the Scottish king, heir to the throne at 3 when Dad died. England and Scotland decided she should marry Edward I's son, another Edward. She was 7. They put her on a ship from Norway to Scotland in 1290. Ship hits bad weather, she gets sick, probably pneumonia or dysentery, and dies on the way, either in Orkney or on the boat. Whole succession crisis erupts, 13 claimants fight over Scotland, and boom, wars of independence, all because a 7-year-old caught a cold on a boat. That's medieval childhood in a nutshell. Even when they survived, the parenting was creative. Louis X of France had a daughter, Joan. Mom was accused of adultery, locked in a tower, possibly murdered. Dad remarried 5 days later. Romance is dead. Joan got raised suspecting she might be illegitimate, which everyone whispered about for decades. She grew up paranoid and ruthless, married her cousin, ruled Navarra, and spent her life proving she belonged. Fun childhood. And discipline? Spare the rod, spoil the heir. Royal kids got beaten for the smallest things. Edward II's son, the future Edward III, got thrashed by his mom's boyfriend Roger Mortimer when he was a teenager because he dared complain about the regime. Edward bided his time and then had Mortimer hanged when he turned 18. Teenage revenge is a dish best served with a side of treason. Wet nurses again. Sometimes they were the only affection these kids ever got. Henry V, Agincourt guy, was apparently super attached to his wet nurse Joan Waring. When he became king, he gave her a pension and a house for life. Rare happy story. Most of the time, the kid barely saw Mom, Dad was off fighting or dying of dysentery, and the governess was some noblewoman who hated children. Then at age 7, boom, off to another household to be raised as a page or lady-in-waiting. No family Christmas cards. Let's check in on the Habsburgs early, because they were already warming up. Joanna of Castile, future mom of Charles V, was born in 1479. Spanish side, but the inbreeding train was rolling. Her mom, Isabella of Castile, had 6 kids. 2 died young, 1 went mad, Joanna herself, later called Juana la Loca. Joanna married Philip the Handsome in 1496. Philip was hot, yeah, but also a walking red flag. Cheated constantly, treated her like garbage. When he died suddenly in 1506, probably typhoid, Joanna lost it. Traveled around Castile with his coffin for months, opening it to kiss the body, convinced someone would steal it. Her dad locked her up in Tordesillas for 47 years. She lived to 75, alone, talking to a corpse in her head. That's what royal childhood plus royal marriage gets you. We haven't even hit the Tudors yet, and my voice is already getting sleepy just thinking about it. But the cribs are still full of tiny doomed princes and princesses, so let's keep floating through the nursery shadows.
All right, stay half awake with me. We're leaving the nursery now and gliding into the wardrobe. Because if medieval life was going to kill you, it wanted to look fabulous while doing it. Picture this. You finally get to dress like the paintings. Velvet, fur, gold thread, jewels the size of walnuts. Sounds dreamy. In reality, every single garment was engineered to make you miserable, deformed, or straight up dead. Let's start at the skin and work our way out. Underwear? Yeah, about that. Most people wore a linen shift or shirt next to the skin, and that was it. You slept in it, worked in it, sweated in it for weeks, then washed it when the moon was in the right phase or whatever. Nobles changed shift daily, luxury, but the washing was still done in lye soap that burned your hands and never quite got the smell out. So you're already marinating in your own juices before you even start layering. Now, the ladies. Let's talk about the Côte-Hardie phase, early 1300s. Tight lacing, low neckline, sleeves so long you trip over them. The goal? Tiny waist, big hips, boobs pushed up to the chin. To achieve this, they sewed the dress directly onto the body with a needle and thread every morning.
Yeah, you read that right. Stitched in. If you had to pee, a servant followed you with scissors. Queen Joan of Navarre supposedly fainted at a banquet because her gown was laced so tight she couldn't breathe. They cut her out right there on the floor while everyone pretended not to stare. By the 1400s, we'd get the houppelande. Massive, floor-length, sleeves wider than a doorway. Beautiful. Also a fire hazard. Margaret of Anjou lost 2 ladies-in-waiting in one winter when their sleeves caught on candles and they went up like Roman candles. The church started preaching against the devil's chimneys, but nobody listened because fashion. Then the farthingale arrives, late 1400s, early 1500s. Basically a giant bell-shaped cage under the skirt. Spanish origin, because of course the Spanish wanted to take up more space. You can't sit properly, you can't fit through doors, and if you fall over, which happens, you're a turtle on your back until 4 servants flip you upright. Anne of Brittany wore one so wide she had to enter rooms sideways. She also had bound feet from childhood to keep them tiny, early European foot-binding trend. So she minced around like a very expensive, very breakable doll. Men weren't safe either. Cod pieces start small in the 1400s. Then, by the 1500s, they're armored jockstraps the size of dinner plates. Henry VIII's surviving armor has one you could serve soup in. The padding inside is wool soaked in vinegar to prevent chafing, which of course just fermented into a nice crotch cheese situation. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, apparently had to have it detached surgically once when the lacing got infected. Fashion. Shoes. Oh my God, the shoes. Pointed toes called poulaines, sometimes so long they tied the tips to the knee with little gold chains so you could walk. Edward IV had to pass a law limiting toe length to 2 inches because knights kept tripping in battle. Then the Chopin phase, platform shoes up to 24 inches high. Venetian courtesans wore them to look tall and sexy, also broke their ankles constantly. One noblewoman in 1493 fell off hers, miscarried, and died of infection. The Doge banned them for a week, then everyone went right back to wobbling. Fabrics? Gorgeous and toxic. Crimson dye came from crushing thousands of Kermes insects, took months and smelled like death. Green came from copper and arsenic. Mary Queen of Scots loved green gowns, also went blind later, possibly from arsenic poisoning through the skin. Gold thread was real gold beaten paper thin and wrapped around silk. Looked amazing, weighed a ton, and if it got wet, it oxidized and turned your neck green. Literally. Fur was status, but also a flea highway. Erlin, sable, whatever. Never cleaned, just aired out on the battlements. Henry III of England once opened a chest of state robes and a rat nest fell out. The chronicles say the king laughed, everyone else gagged. Headgear. Women's hennins, those tall cone hats with veils, could be 2 feet high. They had to duck under doorways or remove the entire wire cage every time they entered a room. Isabeau of Bavaria got stuck in a doorway at a tournament and missed her own coronation procession. The hennin stayed stuck. She had to send a servant back with a saw. Makeup, lead white ceruse for that pale look, mixed with vinegar and painted on thick. Cracked, smelled like a tomb, and slowly poisoned you. Queen Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's wife, used it daily and died at 37 with skin like parchment. Lips and cheeks, mercury-based vermilion. Bonus, hair loss. So they shaved the forehead to a high line and glued on fake hair pieces from dead people. Plague victims were cheap. Perfume was musk, civet, and ambergris. Translation, deer butt, cat butt, and whale vomit. Layered on to cover the fact nobody bathed. Jewelry was its own torture. Rings worn over gloves so your fingers swelled and went purple. Necklaces so heavy they left bruises. Isabella of France wore a ruby the size of a pigeon egg. The chain cut into her collarbone so badly she had permanent scars. Crowns? Gold, heavy, lined with velvet that never got cleaned. Edward the Black Prince supposedly got migraines so bad from wearing his that he had to lie down after coronations. And laundry day, once a year if you were royal. Everything beaten in urine, ammonia whitens, then laid on grass for the sun to bleach. If it rained, tough luck, mildew city.
Servants slept in the wet garments to stretch them back into shape. Yeah. Let's not forget the children. Little princes in miniature armor by age 5, so heavy they could barely walk. Princesses in tiny corsets from age 3 to train the figure. Margaret Beaufort started lacing at 4. By 13, she was 4'11" with a curved spine and chronic pain. Fashion. Even underwear tried to kill you. Women wore chainmail chastity belts when husbands went on crusade. Rusted, caused infections, and the key usually got lost. One poor lady in 1390s Germany supposedly died because her husband got captured in the Holy Land and nobody had a spare key. So next time you see a medieval portrait and think goals, remember, that person couldn't breathe, couldn't sit, smelled like a taxidermy shop, and was slowly being poisoned by their own outfit. And they smiled through it because the painter charged by the hour. Let's keep drifting. The Great Hall is up next, where the food is somehow worse than the clothes.
All right, keep your eyes barely open. We're gliding out of the wardrobe now and floating into the Great Hall for dinner. Candles flickering, tapestries flapping, minstrels plucking the same 3 songs on loop. Looks majestic, smells like a wet dog that rolled in garlic and despair. Grab a seat on the bench, no backs, no cushions, enjoy the spine compression, and let's watch the feast arrive, because medieval dining was less fine cuisine and more slow-motion Russian roulette with spoiled meat. First thing you notice, everyone eats from the same dishes. Huge platters in the middle, no personal plates unless you're the king. You tear off a chunk of bread, called a trencher, hollow it out, and use it as an edible plate. When you're done, the soggy bread goes to the poor or the dogs. Hygiene tip: wash your hands in the communal bowl that's been passed around 40 greaselingers already. The water's changed maybe once per course. If you're lucky, they added rose petals so it looks pretty while breeding bacteria. The food itself? Seasoned like someone robbed a spice merchant and panicked. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, everything drowned in sweet spices because half the meat is already turning and they're trying to mask it. A boar's head comes in wearing a little hat, apple in mouth, eyes replaced with raisins. Cute. The boar died 3 weeks ago and has been hanging in the cellar ever since. They boiled it twice and soaked it in vinegar, but you can still taste the gamey funk. If you're really unlucky, it's mortuus, or a stew of pork cooked in its own blood, thickened with bread and dyed purple for fun. Tastes like iron and regret. Fish on fast days, which is about 150 days a year, is even worse. Salted herring that's been in barrels since last Lent. They rehydrate it in warm water and serve it with almond milk sauce, because dairy's forbidden. The sauce separates into oily clumps. You chew around the bones and pray you don't swallow a tapeworm egg. Lampreys were a delicacy. Henry I of England died in 1135 from a surfeit of lampreys, which is medieval for ate too many slimy eels and his gut exploded. Doctors said it was bad for his constitution. Translation: food poisoning. Nobles show off with subtleties. Basically medieval jello sculptures of castles or saints made from sugar and almond paste. They're too expensive to eat, so they just sit there melting while everyone claps politely. Meanwhile, the kitchen is a sweat lodge of chaos. Open fires, no ventilation, cooks blind from smoke, cauldrons the size of bathtubs, one dropped ladle and you're eating floor seasoning. Rats run across the rafters, dropping little presents into the soup. The head cook tastes everything with the same wooden spoon he uses to stir the chamber pots clean. Multitasking. Drinks, wine if you're fancy, ale if you're not. Both watered down because the good stuff is for guests. Hippocras, spiced sweet wine, is served at the end to settle the stomach. It's basically mulled wine with extra pepper and a prayer. Sometimes they add gold leaf because rich people think swallowing metal is healthy. Spoiler, it isn't. Henry VII's mom, Margaret Beaufort, drank so much Hippocras her teeth rotted out by 50. Table manners.
are a performance. You're not allowed to wipe your hands on your clothes. Rude. So you use the tablecloth. By the end of the meal, it's a Jackson Pollock of grease and wine. If you burp or fart, you're supposed to do it quietly and blame the dog under the table. Speaking of dogs, they're everywhere, fighting over scraps, humping legs, occasionally peeing on your shoe. The Lord's favorite hound gets the best cuts of meat, while the scullery boy gets kicked for dropping a platter. And the seating chart is a political minefield. Sit too high, you're arrogant. Sit too low, you're insulting your host. Edward IV once moved a bishop down the table because the guy wore the wrong color robe. The bishop sulked for a week. In Scottish courts, they still use the old Celtic heroes portion. Biggest chunk of meat went to the bravest warrior. If you claimed it and someone disagreed, you fought right there between courses. Knives already on the table, perfect. Royal kids eat up on the high table from age 5, learning to sit still for 4 hours while drunk uncles shout. Little Catherine of Aragon, future wife of Henry VIII, was sent to England in 1501 and wrote home that the food was so greasy she lived on baked apples for months. Her ladies got scurvy because fresh fruit was peasant food. Then there's the voidee, the final course where everyone staggers to another room for sweets and wine. You're already bloated, half drunk, and now they bring out marzipan shaped like ships and sugared rose petals. You eat it because refusing is rude, then spend the night praying to the privy gods. The privy, by the way, is a hole over the moat or a chamber pot behind a curtain. Queens had close stools, fancy boxes with velvet cushions, but still no plumbing. Servants empty them out windows. If the wind shifts, enjoy the splashback. Let's check in on a real feast, the 1954 Feast of the Pheasant in Lille. Philip the Good of Burgundy wanted to launch a new crusade, so he served 48 courses, live birds flying out of pies, a naked boy painted gold riding a tiger through the hall. Don't ask. Guests swore oaths on a pheasant to go fight the Turks. Almost nobody actually went. The boy nearly died of gold poisoning from the paint. Worth it for the vibes. By the time you waddle out, your stomach is doing flips, your clothes are stained, and you probably promised your firstborn to some duke you barely know. The hall smells like a tavern fire mixed with vomit. Minstrels are still going. Somewhere a drunk knight is crying about his horse. And tomorrow they do it all again, because leftovers are for peasants and dogs. Let's ease out of the hall now. The night air is cold, the privies are calling, and the mattress full of fleas is waiting. Sweet dreams.
Okay, breathe through your mouth and stay with me. We're leaving the Great Hall now, weaving past the drunk squires and the dogs fighting over a half-eaten swan, and heading toward the part of the castle nobody puts on the postcards, the privy, the physician's chamber, and the quiet little chapel where they'll eventually park your coffin. Because in medieval times, the second you finished dinner, you had roughly 4 hours before something inside you tried to become outside you, and the only question was how much it was going to hurt. Let's start with the toilet situation, because it's worse than you think. In a castle, the fancy option is the guard-robe, a stone seat built into the wall with a straight drop into the moat or a pit 50 feet below. No flush, no toilet paper, just a hole and gravity. Wind blows up the shaft and sprays you with yesterday's greatest hits. In winter, it freezes solid, so you're basically perched over an ice luge of frozen waste. Servants sometimes had to chip it out with pickaxes. In summer, the smell is biblical. Flies the size of sparrows. Henry III of England once passed out on the Tower of London guard-robe and had to be carried out by his knights because the stench overwhelmed him. King things. Peasants? A ditch, a bush, or a communal bucket. Towns had public latrines over rivers. London Bridge had 130 seats in a row. Basically a medieval porta-potty food court. You paid a penny, sat cheek to cheek with strangers, chatted about the weather while everything plopped into the tens. Tide comes in, tide goes out, problem solved until the next cholera outbreak. Toilet paper didn't exist. Rich people used scraps of cloth called arsewisp that got laundered, theoretically.
Everyone else used hay, moss, or the classic left hand plus a bucket of water. If you were really classy, you used a gooseneck. Yes, the actual neck of a goose, feathers still on. Edward IV supposedly kept a groom of the stool whose entire job was to wipe the royal bottom and gossip about how the king's day was going. Annual salary, a nice house, and the right to sell the used hay as souvenirs. People bought it. People are weird. Now, let's say dinner is winning and you need a doctor. Good luck. The average physician studied astrology longer than anatomy. First question, what sign were you born under? Second question, have you tried bleeding? Their entire medical theory is based on 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, they fix it by cutting you open and draining until you pass out. Bonus points if they use dirty lancets and give you sepsis. Leeches are popular too. Cute little guys in a jar, slapped on your neck like living jewelry. John of Ardern, famous 14th century surgeon, wrote a whole treatise on how to treat anal fistulas with a mixture of pig dung and honey. It worked sometimes, mostly because the patient was too embarrassed to come back. King Henry V, Agincourt hero, national legend, died at 35 from dysentery he picked up besieging Meaux. His doctors treated it by applying hot poultices made of figs and barley to his stomach until his skin blistered, then gave him laxatives to purge the evil humors. He shat himself to death in a French castle while his army watched the Wonder Boy waste away. They carried his boiled corpse home in a barrel of wine so it wouldn't rot on the trip. That was lovely. Surgery without anesthesia is exactly as fun as it sounds. They knock you out with a sponge soaked in opium, mandrake, and hemlock, called a dwale. Sometimes you wake up mid-procedure. Sometimes you never wake up. Cataract surgery? A needle straight into the eyeball to push the lens out of the way. Amputation? Saw through the bone while 2 guys hold you down and a third cauterizes with a red-hot iron. The scream echoes for miles. Survival rate? Maybe 1 in 3 if you don't bleed out or die of infection 3 days later. Women get the special treatment. Childbirth is handled by midwives who know what they're doing. But if something goes wrong, you call the priest, not the doctor. Doctors think the womb wanders around the body like a lost hamster causing hysteria. Treatment? Fumigation. Stick burning herbs under her skirt. Or marriage, because obviously sex fixes everything. Margaret of Anjou labored for 36 hours with her first kid. The doctors wanted to cut her open, but she refused. Kid came out fine. Second pregnancy? Miscarriage, followed by years of being called barren while her husband prayed in the corner. Mental health? Doesn't exist. If the king goes mad, Charles VI of France, glass delusion, remember? They lock him in a room and play loud music to scare the devils out. If a commoner starts hearing voices, it's witchcraft and you're burned. Depression? You're just melancholy. Too much black bile. Fix? Eat more rabbit and listen to lute music. Plague doctors show up in the 1300s wearing the full beak mask stuffed with lavender because bad air causes disease. They poke your buboes with a stick and charge you double. Most of them die anyway because germs don't care about lavender. The dance of the death becomes a whole art genre because everyone's just waiting their turn. And when it finally gets you, dysentery, plague, pox, childbirth, random jousting accident, they wrap you in a shroud, stick you in a wooden coffin if you're lucky, and parade you to the church. No embalming unless you're a king, in which case they boil you, scrape the flesh off, and send the bones home separately. See Henry V again. The funeral feast is the same food that kills you, so the cycle continues. Your tomb effigy shows you looking serene and 30 years old forever. Reality? You died at 33, missing half your teeth, covered in sores, and smelling faintly of the privy you collapsed in. But hey, at least the priest said some nice Latin words. Let's drift out of the sick room now. The chapel bells are tolling, the candles are guttering, and somewhere a new baby is being born into the same beautiful nightmare.
All right, keep drifting. We're slipping out of the sick room, past the blood-stained sheets and the jar of leeches, and gliding into the castle chapel. It's quiet in here, right? Wrong. This place is a 24/7 anxiety machine dressed up in incense and stained glass. The point of medieval religion wasn't comfort. It was to remind you every single day that you're a walking sack of sin who's definitely going to burn unless you pay up, shut up, and pray harder. You walk in, well, shuffle, because your knees are already shot from kneeling on stone floors. The air is thick with frankincense and that faint undersmell of damp crypt. Candles everywhere, because natural light is for peasants. The walls are painted with the Last Judgment, Jesus looking mildly annoyed while demons shove kings and popes into cauldrons. Helpful. Right above the altar, there's usually a doom painting. Skeletons dancing, souls being weighed, a rich guy trying to bribe St. Michael with a bag of gold and getting dragged off anyway. You stare at that every Sunday for 3 hours while the priest drones in Latin you don't understand. Mass itself is a marathon. You're not allowed to sit. Benches are a newfangled heresy in most places. You stand, kneel, genuflect, cross yourself so many times your shoulder aches. The priest has his back to you the entire time because he's talking to God, not the peasants. If you nod off, and you will, the church warden whacks you with a long stick. Kids get it worst. Richard II supposedly fell asleep during coronation practice mass and got a sharp reminder from the archbishop that even kings answer to God. He was 10. Confession is mandatory once a year, minimum. You kneel in a dark box and list every bad thought you've had since last Easter. The priest, who probably knows exactly who you are because villages are tiny, sighs dramatically and assigns penance. Say 50 Hail Marys, fast for a week, or, if you're rich, pay for a new stained glass window. Indulgences are already a thing by the 1300s. Buy a papal letter that knocks years off your time in purgatory. They're basically medieval GoFundMe for church roofs. Everyone pretends it's spiritual, everyone knows it's a tax with extra guilt. Purgatory is the real star of the show. Nobody thinks they're going straight to heaven. Even saints assume they do a few thousand years in the cosmic oven first. So you spend your entire life trying to shorten the sentence. Chantries are huge. Rich people build private chapels and pay priests to say Mass for their souls 24/7 after they die. Edward III set up one at Windsor that was supposed to run forever. It lasted about 200 years before Henry VIII sold the silver. Close enough. Saints are your customer service reps. Got a toothache? Pray to Saint Apollonia. Had her teeth pulled out by pagans. Super relatable. Lost something? Saint Anthony. Scared of lightning? Saint Barbara. There's a saint for everything, and they all want candles, pilgrimages, or little silver body parts pinned to their statues. Women having rough pregnancies hang tiny wax babies on St. Margaret's altar. The church makes bank. Speaking of pilgrimages, if you can afford it, you're supposed to go to Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, or Jerusalem at least once. Most people can't, so they buy badges instead. Little tin souvenirs that prove you meant to go. Wear enough badges, and maybe God gives partial credit. Chaucer's pilgrims in the 1380s are the rare ones who actually went, and even they spent the whole trip getting drunk and telling dirty stories. The church pretended not to notice. Relics are the medieval version of eBay scams. Every church claims to have a piece of the true cross, a vial of the Virgin's milk, or John the Baptist's head. There were at least 12 of those floating around Europe. People kissed them, rubbed them on sick kids, pay to touch them. The bigger the relic, the bigger the crowds, the bigger the donation box. Henry I of England kept a piece of the cross in his bedroom for protection. Didn't stop him from dying of lampreys. Friars are the street preachers who show up yelling that everyone's going to hell unless they repent right now. Dominic and Francis started nice, but by 1400, half of them are wandering around in rags telling queens they dress like whores. Margaret of Anjou once had a friar dragged out of her chapel mid-rant for calling her French. He came back the next week. Commitment. Then there are the flagellants, groups of guys who strip to the waist and whip themselves bloody in the town square because the Black Death is obviously God's punishment and pain makes him chill out. Church banned them in 1349, but they kept popping up for centuries.
You'd be trying to buy bread, and suddenly there's 20 dudes flogging each other while singing hymns. Normal Tuesday. Death is literally in the architecture. Transitombs. Rich person commissions a statue of themselves as a rotting corpse covered in worms. You lie in bed looking up at your own future skeleton grinning down at you. Sweet dreams. John Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, had one in the 1430s complete with toads eating his entrails. His wife slept under it for 30 years. Relationship goals. Even the music is designed to make you feel small. Polyphony is just starting, but most churches still do plain chant. Long, slow, echoey notes that sound like ghosts warming up. You leave Mass feeling like you've been emotionally waterboarded by God. And when you finally die, the priests argue over who gets to bury you, because burial fees are cash. If you're rich, they ring the big bell for hours. If you're poor, you get a quick hole in the churchyard and maybe a wooden cross that rots in 5 years. Either way, the message is the same. You spent your whole life terrified of this moment, and now it's here. Let's drift out through the side door now. The graveyard is quiet, the moon is up, and somewhere a priest is already counting tomorrow's offerings.
All right, stay half dozing. We're slipping out of the chapel's side door, past the fresh graves and the priest counting coins by candlelight, and drifting into the one thing everyone pretends is romantic: medieval marriage. Spoiler, it's a business merger with crying, consummation checks, and a side of lifelong resentment. Let's watch a few of these love stories unfold in real time, because nothing says bedtime story like a 12-year-old bride sobbing her way to the altar. First rule: nobody marries for love unless they're peasants who already have nothing to lose. If you're noble or royal, your wedding is decided before you're potty trained. Contracts signed in triplicate, dowries weighed like sacks of grain, and the bride's virginity inspected by a committee of old ladies with candles. Eleanor of Aquitaine was 11 when she got engaged to the future Louis VII of France. She rode across country with a retinue bigger than most armies because her dad died and she was suddenly the richest heiress in Europe. Louis was 16, pious, and terrified of girls. Their wedding night was apparently so awkward the entire French court placed bets on whether it actually happened. It did, eventually. They still managed to produce 2 daughters before the Pope annulled it because, checks notes, 4th cousins once removed. Sure. Annulments were the medieval version of a Vegas divorce, except you had to prove you were too related, impotent, or bewitched. Edward IV secretly married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 while he was already engaged to half of Europe. When the news broke, his entire council lost their minds. She was a widow, 5 years older, English, gasp, and her family was mid-tier nobility at best. Edward basically shrugged and said, "Yeah, I love her, deal with it." They had 10 kids, most of whom died or disappeared later, but for a minute it looked like a fairy tale. Then he died at 39, bloated and sick, and everything fell apart. Love wins. Let's float over to Scotland for Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter. In 1503, they shipped her north at age 13 to marry James IV, who was 30. She cried the entire way from London to Edinburgh. James was charming, athletic, and already had at least 5 illegitimate kids running around. Their wedding was gorgeous, cloth of gold, fireworks, the works. But Margaret spent the first year homesick and writing letters begging to come home. She grew up, toughened up, had a son, and then James got himself killed at Flanders in 1313, charging downhill into a swamp because honor. Margaret was 23, widowed, and suddenly regent for a baby king. She remarried fast, Archibald Douglas, hot but broke, got pregnant, lost the regency, and spent the next decade in a custody war over her own kids. Romance. Child brides were standard.
Isabella of Angoulême was about 12 when she married King John in 1200. John was 33, already excommunicated, and nicknamed Soft Sword for losing Normandy. Isabella was gorgeous. John was obsessed. He kept her dressed like a doll and ignored the kingdom. Barons revolted, locked her in a castle for years, and John died of dysentery in 1616 after losing the Jewel River. Isabella waited exactly 3 months, then married her ex-fiancé, a guy she'd been engaged to before John stole her. They had 9 more kids. She spent the rest of her life plotting to get her English dower lands back and eventually retired to a convent where she died at 58, still beautiful and still furious. Sometimes the bride was older and the groom was the child. Richard II married Isabella of Valois in 1396. He was 29, she was 6. The official story was for peace with France. The real story was Richard was lonely after his first wife died and wanted a symbolic alliance. They never consummated it, obviously, but Richard carried her around court like a living trophy and gave her dolls in miniature crowns. When he got deposed in 1399, new King Henry IV kept her in England for 4 years so Richard's supporters couldn't use her, then sent her home at 10 with all her dowry intact and 0 memories of a husband except a creepy older guy who cried a lot. Consummation pressure was brutal. Margaret Beaufort was 12 when she married Edmund Tudor, 24. He got her pregnant immediately and then died of plague, leaving her a 13-year-old widow in labor for days. The baby barely survived. Margaret never conceived again. She spent the rest of her life obsessed with her son's safety and controlling every detail of his marriages. Trauma? What trauma? Adultery was common. Consequences varied. John of Gaunt married Blanche of Lancaster for money, then fell hard for Catherine Swynford, his wife's lady-in-waiting, after Blanche died. They had 4 kids while he was still married to someone else. Eventually, he married Catherine, legitimized the kids, and founded the Beaufort line. Court whispered, but nobody could touch him because he was the king's uncle and richer than God. Queens caught cheating? Different story. Joan of Navarre, Henry IV's second wife, got accused of witchcraft by her stepson Henry V because he wanted her money. Locked her in a castle for 4 years for safety. She was in her 40s, never saw a trial, and got released when Henry died. Just normal step-family stuff. Love letters existed, but they read like they were written by lawyers on depressants. Henry VIII's early letters to Anne Boleyn are the closest you get to spicy, and even those are 90% "I'm dying without you" and 10% creepy control vibes. Most noble couples wrote like this: "My very dear lord, the weather is cold, your son has the flux again, please send money." Signed, your obedient bedfellow. Dowagers sometimes got to choose their second husbands and went feral. Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis VII. She was 28-ish, he was 18, and she brought half of France as a dowry. They had 8 kids and spent 20 years fighting like cats before she helped their sons rebel, and he locked her up for 16 years. When he died, she popped out at 55, ruled England as regent, and lived to 82 still meddling. Iconic. So yeah, medieval love was less hearts and flowers and more hostage negotiation with a priest present. You promised to obey, they promised to protect, and everyone quietly hoped the other one died first so they could remarry for money. Let's drift out of the marriage bed now. The cradle is rocking again, another tiny pawn is on the way, and the cycle just keeps turning.
All right, stay nice and drowsy. We're leaving the marriage bed, where half the heirs were conceived under duress, and drifting out through the castle gate, past the dung heap and the snoring guards, toward the one place every medieval man claimed he wanted to be, the battlefield. Movies sold you shining knights thundering across green fields, lances sparkling, banners waving. Reality was 3 weeks of sitting in ankle-deep mud, eating moldy bread, shitting yourself to death before you ever saw the enemy. Let's settle in and watch the slowest, wettest, most boring disaster in pre-modern history. First, getting there. You don't just ride out like it's a weekend joust. A real campaign starts with months of arguing over who's paying for what. The king sends letters demanding knights show up with X number of men for 40 days, standard feudal service. Most of them get sick or send their grumpy cousin instead. Edward III in 1346 had to pawn the crown jewels to bribe enough guys to sail for Cressy. Once everyone finally agrees, you march. Average speed? 12 miles a day if the carts don't break, the horses don't founder, and it isn't raining. It's always raining. Armor weighs 70 pounds, so knights ride palfreys and only put the full plate on at the last minute. Everyone else walks. Peasants conscripted as archers carry their bows wrapped in cloth because damp strings snap. Camp life is 99% of war. You dig latrine trenches if the captain's feeling fancy, otherwise just pick a bush and hope the wind doesn't shift. Food. Salt pork that's more maggot than meat, hardtack you have to soak in water to avoid breaking teeth, and ale that tastes like feet. Dysentery hits within a week. Half the army is squatting in the woods by day 10. Henry V lost more men to the bloody flux outside Harfleur in 1415 than he did in the actual Battle of Agincourt. They called it the Siege of the Bowels. Then the waiting. Armies park a mile apart and stare at each other for days, sometimes weeks. Nobody wants to attack first because the defender has the advantage. So you send heralds back and forth insulting each other's moms in fancy French until someone gets bored and charges. Cressy was like that. English sat on a hill for 2 days while the French argued about who got to attack first. The French finally charged uphill in the rain after dark, got shredded by longbows, and left 1,500 knights dead in the mud. English casualties? A couple hundred. War. Longbows, by the way, are not elegant. An English archer trains from age 7, pulling 120 to 180 pounds of draw weight. Their skeletons are lopsided, right shoulder blade twice the size, spine twisted. They loose 10 arrows a minute, 600 yards range, and the arrows punch straight through plate armor at 100 yards. French knights at Agincourt described it like a metal hailstorm. When the arrows ran out, the archers waded in with mallets and daggers to finish the job. Chivalry died face down in a French plowed field. Knights hated archers. Commoners killing nobles from a distance? Rude. After battles, they sometimes executed captured bowmen just for existing. The nobles, they ransomed, because a live earl is worth 10,000 pounds and a dead one is just heavy. Sieges were worse than battles. You sit outside a walled town for months trying to starve them out while your own army starves faster. Catapults lob dead horses over the walls to spread disease. Defenders pour boiling oil, or just boiling water if they're broke, and shout insults. Rouen in 1418-19 was so bad people ate rats, then cats, then shoe leather, then each other. When Henry V finally took the city, he paraded the survivors out. 12,000 skeletons in rags, and the chronicles say grown men cried at the sight. Then he hanged a few for fun and moved on. Chivalry was mostly PR. The rules said don't kill nobles, ransom them nicely, protect women, etc. In practice, towns that resisted got sacked, civilians raped and murdered, everything burned. After Limoges in 1370, Edward the Black Prince, too sick to walk, was carried around in a litter, watching his men massacre 3,000 people because the bishop changed sides. He died a year later, screaming in pain from whatever was eating his guts. Karma slow but thorough. Wounded? Good luck. Surgeons saw off limbs on a bench while you bite a stick. cauterize with hot pitch or boiling oil. Both work great at causing shock. Arrow wounds? Push the arrow through if it has a bodkin point, or dig it out with tongs if it's barbed. Tourniquets are a thing, but infection is guaranteed. Gangrene sets in, you turn black, you die smelling like old hamburger. James IV of Scotland took an arrow to the jaw at Floaters in 1313, kept fighting, then bled out slowly because nobody could stop the bleeding in the rain. Prisoners of war got cages sometimes. After Poitiers in 1356, the French King John II was captured and lived in the Tower of London for 4 years, eating off gold plates while France paid his ransom in installments. His son Louis broke parole and escaped, so John, weirdly honorable, went back to England voluntarily and died there. Meanwhile, his kingdom fell apart. Mercenaries were the worst. Free companies roamed between wars, robbing everyone. Bertrand du Guesclin made a career fighting them, then became one when payroll dried up. They'd sack a town, sell the survivors to slavery, and move on. The Pope hired them to fight Turks, then they sacked Italian cities instead. Reliable fellas. And the smell. Thousands of unwashed men, horses, corpses rotting in fields, latrine trenches overflowing. After Agincourt, the field was so deep in blood and mud that they buried the dead in mass graves and still found bones centuries later. Crows followed armies like groupies. When it was over, survivors limped home missing limbs, teeth, or sanity. Pensions didn't exist. Maybe a grateful king gave you a village if you were lucky. Most just went back to farming with one arm and nightmares. So next time you think medieval warfare was glorious, picture this. You're knee-deep in French mud, diarrhea running down your leg, watching your best friend get an arrow through the face, while some noble you've never met argues about whose turn it is to die for glory. Let's drift away from the battlefield now. The crows are circling, the rain keeps falling, and somewhere a herald is already writing the lies for the chronicle.
All right. Keep that breathing slow and steady. We're finally drifting back through the castle gate, past the battlefield ghosts still stuck in the mud, past the chapel where the priests are still counting coins by candlelight, and into the long, quiet medieval night. The torches are burning low, the dogs have stopped fighting over scraps, and almost everyone is either drunk, sick, or pretending to sleep. Let's just float through the last few hours of a perfectly ordinary day that nobody survived unchanged. You stagger up the spiral stairs, stone steps worn into scoops by 1,000 boots, leaning on the rope because your knees are shot from a lifetime of kneeling on cold floors. The bedchamber is dark, except for one tallow candle that smells like burning fat. The straw mattress has been turned since this morning, luxury, but you can still hear the fleas waking up for their night shift. You peel off the layers, outer robe stiff with spilled wine and food, under tunic glued to your skin with sweat, hose that haven't been washed since Lent. Everything gets tossed in a chest because laundering is for spring cleaning and spring is a rumor. The bed itself is a wooden box with curtains you pull shut to keep the drafts out and the bugs in. If you're noble, there's a feather mattress on top of the straw, lumpy, damp, and home to at least one family of mice. You lie down fully clothed except for shoes because it's too cold to strip and too much effort to put anything back on. Your spouse is already snoring on the other side of the bed, 3 feet away because the mattress dips in the middle like a valley. If you're royal, servants are still in the room, curled up on the floor or sitting in the corner in case you need water or a chamber pot at 3 a.m. Privacy is for peasants. Sleep isn't peaceful. You drift off to the sound of someone coughing up a lung in the next room, dogs barking in the courtyard, and the faint drip of the garde-robe saft. Dreams are vivid because half the population is low-grade malnourished and the other half is drunk on small beer. You dream of food, of falling, of teeth crumbling out of your head. Around 2 a.m., someone screams, probably a nightmare, maybe a rat the size of a cat. Nobody gets up. Everyone just rolls over and pulls the blanket higher. If you're a woman who just gave birth, you're not sleeping at all. You're bleeding into the straw, the midwife is dozing in the corner, and the baby is either nursing or screaming. If the baby stops screaming and doesn't start again, nobody says anything until morning. Then they carry out another tiny bundle to the churchyard and tell you to try again next year. Dawn comes way too early. The first rooster has a personal vendetta. The castle bell rings for prime, around 5 or 6 a.m., depending on the season. Servants groan, dogs start barking again, and someone dumps a bucket out a window with the half-hearted "Garde l'eau" that nobody believes anymore. You stagger up the spiral stairs, scratch the new bites, cough up whatever's been brewing in your lungs all night, and start the whole thing over. Most people never made it to old age. 35 was a respectable run. 40 was bragging rights. 50, they wrote songs about you. Eleanor of Aquitaine hit 82 because she was built different and had the best doctors money could buy. Everyone else just wore out. Teeth gone, joints swollen, eyesight fading, chronic pain from old injuries that never healed right. The chronicles say, died of old age, when they mean, finally gave up after decades of low-grade everything. When it's your turn, they wash you with warm wine if you're important, wrap you in a linen shroud, and lay you on a bier in the chapel you spent your life paying for. The priest says the words, the bells toll, and your heirs immediately start arguing over who gets the good silver cup. Your body goes into the crypt or the churchyard, rich folk inside, poor folk outside under the drip line so the rain keeps the smell down. Within a generation, nobody remembers exactly which bones are yours unless you paid for a fancy brass plaque. And that's it. One average medieval life. A long, slow, itchy, smelly grind from cradle to crypt, with a few festivals and a couple of half-decent harvests if you were lucky. No weekends, no retirement, no antibiotics, no privacy, no central heating, and a 50-50 chance your own teeth would try to kill you before age 30. So next time you complain about Monday mornings, remember, at least your mattress doesn't have its own ecosystem. Your boss isn't trying to marry you off to a 40-year-old French count for 3 villages and a horse, and nobody's bleeding you with leeches because you looked pale. We've drifted all the way through the day now, from that first miserable sunrise to this last quiet exhale. The candle's almost out, the fleas are settling in for the night, and somewhere far away, a rooster is already warming up for tomorrow. Close your eyes. You're not waking up in 1350. You made it back. Sleep tight. And that's the end of our long, slow float through a world that smelled like wet dog and despair. If you drifted off somewhere around the privies, I won't tell. Thanks for spending the night with me. Like, subscribe, all that gentle stuff. I'll be here next time with another bedtime nightmare from history. Good night.